Hi. So I want to talk about the first day ethics exercise that I hope that you've done. And I assigned. The first case that you're asked to consider is called drug shortage. So let me just read it. There are 5 people in room B and 1 person in room A, all of whom have the same disease and all of whom will die if not treated soon. There's enough medicine on hand to cure all 5 of the people in room B, but since the person in room A has a more advanced case, it would take all of the available supply just to save him. In drug shortage, does morality direct you to save the 1 or the 5? So a couple things. One is this is not supposed to be a hard decision. You should take the medicine to room B and save the 5. Some people might want to ask questions like, well, what if the people in room B are Hitler and I can kill, what if they're my friends or family? Why can't I just wait for more medicine? I mean, all of these sort of avoid the moral issue, so we should just elaborate on the case in whatever way forces us to keep facing the same difficult moral question. The way that I sometimes think about this is imagine yourself as the medical doctor, assistant, whatever, on an oil rig. All the other people on the oil rig are 18-year-old oil workers. You don't know anything about them other than that. There's some sort of explosion, and now they're all unconscious, and there's no one else except for you and these 6. So I can either save the 5 or the 1. Do I save the 5 or do I save the 1? Save the 5. There's a similar case to this that actually happened that I heard. I'm sure this sort of stuff happens all the time. But there was, after the Haiti earthquake, there was a case of an elderly woman who was using up all of the hospital's oxygen supply. And the hospital tends to need the oxygen. They realized they would need it for other patients who came in later in the day, later in the week, because when they're put under, unconscious for surgery, they often need oxygen to help them to breathe. And this woman was using up all of their supply. So the question was, do we kill her or stop giving her oxygen to save the other people who come in who will need it later? What they ultimately did was they just transferred her to a hospital that they knew didn't have any oxygen. So they were sort of evading responsibility for their decision, which I think was probably the shittiest thing they could have done. But in any case, that case is actually a little different because the other people aren't there. In any case, in this particular case, you've got the medicine, you're standing in a hallway, there's a door to your left, there's a door to your right. Which door do I go to? Room B has 5 people I can save. Room A has 1 person I can save. The obvious answer is going to room B. Okay, so transplant. The 5 people in room B are in need of organs. 1 needs a heart, 2 needs a lung, and 2 need a kidney, and they will all die if they're not given transplant soon. Unfortunately, no organs are presently available, but there is a person in room A in for a checkup who could be given a lethal injection instead of the inoculation he is expecting, thereby making his organs available to save the 5 others. In transplant, does morality direct you to save 1 or the 5? If in the first case, it seems like our reasoning for saving the 5 was to, save the most lives, to do what is required to make the world a better place, to make sure there is as many people who get to survive, as few as possible grieving families. But that sort of reasoning in the transplant case leads to a counterintuitive result, which is that we should go into room A, give him a lethal injection to get his organs to save the 5 people in room B. Again, people try to evade the real moral interesting question here. They say things like, well, what if the guy in room A wants to donate his organs? Great, easy answer. Why are we talking about it? We're not going to talk about that case. We're talking about the case where the guy in room A is like, no, you can't have my organs. Another sort of thing that sometimes people bring up, this is really bizarre to me. They say like, well, I don't like lying to people. Lying to people does not seem like the relevantly big issue here. It's more like the killing and taking of organs. But if the issue you're having is lying, you don't have to lie. We can go to room A. We can say, hey, I'm going to give you a lethal injection and take all your organs. I've got these two big orderlies who are going to hold you down and we're going to lock the door. So I don't have to lie to someone to take their organs. Another non-problem. Sometimes people want to say something like, well, why don't I just kill one of the people in room B, make their organs available for the other four? Let's just say that their blood types don't work. I mean, again, these are all just sort of evasions, not really tackling the issue, which can arise, maybe not exactly in this detailed way, but in real life, this sort of question happens where you need to make a decision about sacrificing one person for the sake of the five, for the greater number. What do you do in those sorts of cases? That's what this sort of case is supposed to push us to grapple with. Some philosophers, utilitarians, consequentialists, of course, will say, always save the greater number, always try making the world a better place. So just like in the first case, you save the five and let one die. In this case, you should kill the one and save the five. People in general, well, not in general. There are many philosophers who will disagree with that. Normal people will definitely disagree with that. Let's talk about possible reasonings that you might give in response to these two cases. So you might answer yes, right? Save the five in both cases, and have one dead, or one dead in each case, so two dead totally. And your reasoning you would give is the right thing to do is whatever will have the best consequences and make the world a better place in the end, right? So you're just looking at the end state, and the end state is the best state possible, morally considered, which is the one with the less grieving families and the more people who survive. So the answer in both cases is to save the five. The more intuitive thing that people generally want to say, and at other moral theories that are not utilitarian or consequentialist will say, is probably yes, no. So they'll save the five in the first case. That's the easy case. One will die. And then in the second case, they'll let the five die and not kill the one. What sort of reasoning can we give to justify a yes-no answer? Well, there's a couple that students tend to give in my history of giving these sorts of cases. So one is, it's morally permissible to trade lives between involved persons. So like the five people in the car wrecks are somehow involved, but the guy who's coming in for a checkup isn't. Whereas in the first case, they all have the same sickness and all need this, so they're all sort of involved in the same drama situation. So the idea would be something, it's morally permissible to trade lives between involved persons, but not to rope in an uninvolved person and sacrifice him or her for others. I really do not think that there's, I don't have ever seen a philosopher try to make this sort of argument work, and B, I don't think you could possibly give a really rigorous, intelligent definition of what involved and uninvolved means. And if you tried to give some proposals, I suspect I would pretty easily come up with counterexamples that would make it not work for other reasons. So let's go ahead and dismiss that sort of reasoning. Another possibility that people give, or students have tended to give, is it is morally permissible to kill someone who's already sick and dying, but not kill someone who isn't. So in the first case, I'm killing the guy in room A by not bringing him the medicine, but I'm taking it to the people in room B, and it's okay because he's already sick and dying. Whereas in the second case, when I go in and kill the person in for a checkup and take his organs, he wasn't already sick and dying, so it's somehow impermissible to actively kill him. I also don't think that this is right, although this is starting to get us in the ballpark of a right answer. To one extent, we're always all sick and dying, like we're constantly, our bodies fighting off diseases. I don't really know what it means to be, already sick and dying. He's not sick and dying. If you gave him the drug, then he'd recover. So it's only already, in the sense that, if I stopped eating food, I'm using up energy, and if I don't eat food, I'll die. So I'm dying. If you don't give me the medicine, I'll die. But if you give me the medicine, I'll live. Like if you give me food, So I don't see this as a good way to go. This will come up again when we talk about euthanasia, because a lot of times people might want to try arguing that in cases of euthanasia, when someone is dying of a disease, they'll be dead in 6 months, but it's going to be a very painful death. So you give a mercy killing because they're asking for it and kill them. A couple differences. A, they're asking for it in that case. And B, I think there's nothing you can do to save them, whereas in this case, there is something you can do to save them, giving them the medicine. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think that those are euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide are different cases from the cases we're talking about here. And so the idea of like already dying doesn't really apply here. He's not already dying if you give him the medicine. I think maybe that's that, and the fact that he doesn't want to die are both relevantly important differences between physician-assisted suicide and these sorts of cases. The third reasoning, which is I think the best of, well, we'll look at a fourth, but the third of the best of the three that we've talked about so far, and really I think gets at what the second one is trying to get at, but not quite getting right, is that it's morally permissible to passively let an innocent person die to accomplish a goal, but not to actively kill an innocent person. And the reason I think that tracks with this already sick and not already sick line of reasoning, is that when someone's already sick, you can just let them die. Whereas if they're not already sick, you have to actively kill them. So people who propose this sort of already sick versus not sick distinction, I think that they're really trying to get at is probably this active killing versus passive letting die distinction, which would allow us to say yes, no, right? Yes, save the 5 in the first case where you take the medicine to room B and save the 5 who need it, and let the person in room A die. Let him passively die. You don't actively kill him. Whereas in the second case, don't go to room B and give the person a lethal injection to make his organs available to save the other 5, because that's an active killing as opposed to a passive letting die. Okay. So that pushes us, I think, to this third sort of active-passive distinction, killing versus letting die distinction. Maybe this is not the sort of distinction you came up with. There is a fourth that we're about to get to, but let's talk about the third case. So this is a combination of the first two. Let's call it drug transplant. So in drug transplant, the people in room B are the same as in transplant. So they are the 5 people who need 5 organs. And the person in room A is the same as in drug shortage. So that's the person who needs the medicine. If the person in room A dies of his illness, his organs will not be damaged and thus can be used to save the 5. Is it permissible to withhold the drug from him? So in this case, I've got the drug. I don't have competing claims for using of the drug. There's only one person who needs it, the guy in room B. And now if I do the same thing as I did in the first case, which is just not bring him the medicine, he'll die. And now I get the organs to save the people in the second case, the people who needed the organs. So I'm in here, again, the question is, in drug transplant, does morality direct you to save the 1 or the 5? If we take the killing, letting die distinction, the active versus passive distinction, here we have to say yes, or save the 5, because I can let him die by not bringing him the medicine, just like I did in the first case, and then his organs are available to save the 5 people who need the organs in the second case. So when we apply the sort of reasoning, the right thing is to do whatever will have the best consequences, make the world a better place. It's always yes, yes, yes. Always save the 5. If we try applying the sort of active passive distinction, killing, letting die distinction, and then we end up with the answer yes, no, yes. So save the 5, save the 1, save the 5. That is counterintuitive. I think the active passive distinction, killing versus letting die distinction, I don't really find much appeal about that distinction in general. This has gone before the Supreme Court fairly recently because the federal government's allowed to regulate interstate commerce. So if you sell things across state borders, the federal government can regulate it. But if you do something within your state, the federal government's not supposed to be able to regulate that sort of transaction. And so then the obligation to buy health insurance, the question was, if someone doesn't buy, so they don't do something, does that affect interstate commerce? Does that count as an action? And the Supreme Court's thought, like, well, no, that's an inaction, and inactions can't be governed. Anyway, so you can make this sort of active-passive distinction. I find it really bizarre to think that, like, I sometimes I make fun of it as, like, the calorie-burning interpretation of morality. Like, did you have to burn calories? Well, then it's an action, and I can regulate it. But if it's not burning calories, it's not an action, so morality can't. It's not a killing. Every choice is an action. Just think about actions as not necessarily moving your body, but you're making a choice to withhold the drug. That's going to count as an action on my view. And then the active-passive distinction, the killing, letting decide distinction, is not going to work because you're always making a decision to let die, and that's really going to be an active thing. I mean, that's going to be my line of objection to the killing, the active killing versus the passive letting die distinction. I don't think that, I think that choices are actions, and so you can't say that a choice to let someone die is just passively letting them die because you've actively chosen to let them die. So I'm not gonna buy this distinction. It also comes to this counterintuitive result where in the third case you withhold the medicine, let the person die, and take his organs to save the 5. So we're gonna have a fourth line of reasoning you might offer that gives a more intuitive answer, which lets you save the 5 in the first case and keep the 1 alive in the second and the third case. So yes, no. But let's talk about just interpreting this in terms of moral theories. So what we call utilitarianism or consequentialism, they save the 5 in all 3 cases. So do I save the 5? Yes. I got 15 living patients. I have 3 dead. I have 15 families that are not mourning their dead relative. I have only 3 families that have to deal with a dead sibling, parent, wife, husband. So the utilitarians can say the right thing to do is whatever will have the best consequences, make the world a better place. And they can say, listen, I'm the most moral person. I'm the best doctor. I have 15 living patients and only 3 dead. I only have 3 wives, husbands, children who are mourning their parent, significant other. Whereas if you do anything else, anything other than a utilitarian consequentialist thing, you end up with a worse world, a world with more suffering, with more parents growing up without kids, spouses with their lost husbands, people who lose their lives. And I mean, one of the things the utilitarian can say to the other moral theories is like, you just aren't willing to get your hands dirty and do the hard work to do the real moral thing. Maybe you're too cowardly to do this, but this is actually what morality requires. That's the utilitarian argument. Other moral theories that are not utilitarian, they're going to give different answers. So we've got the Kantian deontologist and the virtue ethicist in particular, the 2 main alternatives to utilitarianism. They actually could give either one of these answers depending on the reasoning they offer. They could either say the active-passive distinction, depending on the, they might say, save the most, but don't actively kill people, only passively let them die, and then you end up with 10 alive and 7 dead. Or they might offer the fourth sort of reasoning that I haven't talked about, which allows you to say, save the 5 in the first case and save the 1 in the second and the third case, where you end up with 7 alive and 11 dead, and claim that that's the moral thing to do. Let's talk about that. So one is you do the active-passive distinction. There are Kantians who have supported that. There are virtue ethicists who have supported that. The other possibility, which we have not discussed, is this intended versus merely foreseen consequences distinction, sometimes called also known as the doctrine of double effect. So it's morally permissible to do something that you merely foresee will lead to the death of an innocent person, but it is not permissible to do something with the intended goal of killing an innocent person. So in the first case, I'm taking the medicine to room B to save the 5. I can foresee that the guy in room A is going to die if I don't bring him the medicine. I don't intend that. I hope he magically recovers. Good for him, right? It's not a part of the plan that he dies. I don't need him to die to save the 5. I hope he lives. In the second case, where I'm killing someone, taking their organs, and saving the 5, his death is a part of the plan. It's integral to me accomplishing the saving of the 5 that he die. It's an intended, not a merely foreseen consequence. So the doctrine of double effect will rule that out as immoral. If he turns out to be like Luke Cage, and I'm trying to cut into his skin and I can't get to his organs or kill him, that's a problem. His death is really something I need. It's not that I hope that he somehow fights me off and keeps me from killing him to get his organs. No, I need him to die and get his organs. So the doctrine of double effect, the intended merely foreseen consequences distinction, is going to prohibit the second case, killing the person to take the organs. Similarly, in the third case, we get the more intuitive result, right? Withholding the medicine so he dies, so I can get his organs. It's a part of the plan that he dies. If he magically recovers, unlike in the first case, if he magically recovers in the third case, I have a problem. I can't save the 5 if he magically recovers, if withholding the medicine doesn't kill him, which shows that I intend for him to die. I need him to die. I'm using him and his death to accomplish my goal of saving the 5. in both the second and the third case, whereas I'm not using him in the first case. His death in the first case is a foreseen but not an intended consequence of my plan in the first case, whereas in the second and the third, it is an intended part of what I'm trying to do. So, if you're a Kantian or a virtue, just in general, if you're not a utilitarian, you might come up with some additional requirements on what it means to be moral beyond just the consequences, some sort of side constraints. You might use the active-passive distinction. You might use the doctrine of double effect. And if you use either of those, you come up with a different answer than what the utilitarian does. I mean, as a Kantian myself, I tend to think that the doctrine of double effect is correct here. And it gets at this idea that you're not supposed to be using people, taking advantage of them for the sake of accomplishing goals, even good ones. Some further cases to think about. Often there's a distinction made between terrorism or terror bombing versus strategic bombing, and this sort of follows this distinction between that the doctrine of double effect makes between merely foreseen and intended consequences. So strategic bombing, I'm going to bomb an enemy position to kill 30 enemy, and I can see a bunch of civilians will die as a side effect. I hope the civilians live. I hope the bomb somehow magically only kills the bad guys and not the civilians. So that's a strategic bombing. The intended goal is to only kill the enemy. The legitimate targets and the civilians dying are a foreseen but unintended consequence. Terror bombing works differently. That's when you go and kill a bunch of civilians or kill the family members of soldiers to try dissuading them from fighting, right? So there, the innocent civilians are the intended target in order to accomplish your goal. That's something we call terror bombing. And it's often argued that terror bombing is either immoral or at least more illegitimate than strategic bombing because it violates the doctrine of double effect. You might think about the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's debatable whether those are legitimate military targets. There's cities, there's railways, military factories in these cities, but really the way in which those ended the war, to the extent that the Soviets also invading or starting to fight the Japanese didn't contribute. Anyway, there's a lot of complicated issues about World War II history and actual situation and the actual way things unfolded. But it does seem like a big component to the Japanese surrender in World War II was not us debilitating their military through the use of nuclear bombs, but the use of nuclear bombs to destroy these civilian towns and the threat that we would just go town by town killing whole civilian populations with nuclear weapons. And that seems like terror bombing, right? So the doctrine of double effect would seem to rule out the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as immoral because they involved the killing of innocent civilians to accomplish, a good moral goal, which probably saved more lives in the end. But the point being that we're not, if we're not consequentialists, that's not enough to justify something. There are restrictions which keep us from doing anything to accomplish good consequences. The ends don't always justify the means. You might think about a thought experiment about torturing the family of a nuclear bomber. So there's some guy with a bomb or a disease he's going to release. You can't get at him somehow, but you can torture his innocent family to get him to give up the code or give up the antidote or give up where he's put the bomb. If you're killing one, his wife and two children and torturing them and killing them so three to save 1 million. Utilitarianism, consequentialism starts to look really attractive, and sticking to these moral side constraints that the Kantian ethicist and the virtue ethicist often propose, or the non-utilitarians propose, can be hard. Virtue ethicists are a little squishy about this because virtue ethicists can say, well, there's not a strict rule, so maybe in the doctor cases you can't. The doctrine of double effect applies, but in these terror cases it doesn't because the virtue ethicist doesn't have a strict rule. We'll talk more about how the virtue ethicists are evasive and squishy about what answers they give. But this gets to us to just a general puzzle about morality, that utilitarianism / consequentialism seems true to us in large number cases when you're killing one innocent person to save 1 million, right? But false in small number cases where I am killing one innocent person to take his organs and save 2 others. Whereas non-utilitarian views seem true to us in small number cases. It's wrong to kill one person to take his organs and save two, but false in large number cases. It seems okay to kill one innocent person to save all of humanity, or 10 million people, or the whole nation. So, I mean, the lesson I take away from this is just that common sense morality is nonsensical and needs to be revised. Like our intuitions, it's either gonna be one way or the other. We're pulled in both directions depending on whether we're thinking about small number cases or large number cases. There's also sort of issues about like what exactly the rule should be. If we put side constraints, is it the active passive killing? Is it the doctrine of double effect? There's also debates about the exact wording and workings of the doctrine of double effect. So there's like a lot of issues there. But in general, I think we're going to end up with a moral system once we think really hard about it and try to get something that's logically consistent and makes sense and doesn't contradict itself. That's going to be surprising and counterintuitive from what we initially thought. What we initially think is, it's intuitive that utilitarianism is wrong in small cases, but right in large cases. I don't see how that's possible. So the work of ethical theory is to work out if it's utilitarianism, if it's not utilitarianism, if it's not utilitarianism, what is the rule going to be? And ultimately, it's going to give us an answer that is going to be counterintuitive in some cases and make us revise our thinking about morality that we had before we thought carefully about things and work them out to make sure that they're consistent and correct. Okay, well, that's the exercise that I hope you did, and that's the lecture. That's the tweet.